I, look, I'm sorry it's an oblong room, but it's full up, which is great. Debbie was referring to Senator Sekai Holland, who's the co-minister for reconciliation, healing and integration in the so-called unity government of President Robert Mugabe, whose thugs almost succeeded in killing her about 3 years ago. And you may remember she was evacuated to Australia, hospitalised here for about 9 months. And when she recovered, with amazing courage, decided to go back. She represents the opposition. I'll be giving, when I finish what I'm to say to you in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to indulge myself in giving you another commercial to encourage you to go to the town hall on Wednesday week to listen to her. And you'll get African boys drumming and African girls dancing as a bonus either side of the lecture. So it's not just a lecture, okay. Now I'm billed as speaking about UN intervention, the peace with justice panacea. And I want to pay, and I've got 15 minutes in which to cover sort of 50 years, which is a sort of task that Alexandra Mayhew always gives me. I want to concentrate in particular on the language you use and we use. There are three concepts in that title. The first is UN, and Christopher's been elaborating that. The second is intervention, and the third is what I mean by peace with justice. In that respect, there are three components: human rights, non-violence, and what I would call a common humanity. And in all the dangerous spots of the world that I've been in, unless you are armed with those concepts and the values that inform them, you can't solve anything, not even with New South Wales police tasers, and I'll come to that in a minute as well. UN, a charter signed in 1945 by 51 countries, now 193 signatories, almost all the countries of the world, so a pretty inclusive notion. The Charter committed, as Christopher said, to foster world peace, to establish harmony between nations, and, most important of all, to promote universal human rights. Two kinds of ways in which it does that, and I'm leaving aside all the autonomous organizations like the World Food Organization, the World Trade Organization, who are, as it were, contracted in a semi-autonomous way to the UN. The two kind of ways are essentially what I would call the humanitarian agencies, such as UNHCR, and the one I'm particularly familiar with, UNRWA, I never quite know how to pronounce it, which is the United Nations Refugee Works Association, established in 1949, which cares for the education, health, food distribution, and modest income maintenance of almost 5 million Palestinians. And I'm going to come to that again in a minute. So the relatively non-controversial and easily praiseworthy features of UN intervention concern the humanitarian agencies. The second feature, the peace-promoting dimension, is about concerns the peace-making efforts sanctioned usually by Chapter 7 of the Charter to establish peace where there is chronic abuse of human rights and so on. Now, there have been over 60 such forms of intervention since 1948. There are currently 16 peacekeeping missions in existence. So when you hear people be totally dismissive of the UN, we need to remember, or you need to be clever advocates in your coffee conversations, that the thin blue line, which is the uniformed UN military or UN forces, it stands between survival and death in so many cases, from the Congo to Darfur, from Haiti to Timor, and so on. Let me come now to the issue of intervention. I'm going to give some illustrations of the controversies and the difficulties facing the UN, whose budget, incidentally, and I pinched this figure from Christopher a few weeks ago, is 0.5%, its peacekeeping budget is 0.5% of what the US military spends globally every year. Absolutely modest. So when the criticism about the UN doing too little too late, that figure needs to be borne in mind. Question of intervention. In about 1962, a book was published in Britain called Scream Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear. It was about the extent of domestic violence across that country. It could have been published in Australia, it could have been published in Afghanistan, Somalia, America, South America, anywhere. It identified a major issue and it challenged a cultural assumption that had 300 years of justification behind it. Namely, in the vernacular English terms, an Englishman's home is his castle, meaning that the man was entitled to do what he liked to women and children within the boundaries of his home. In a minute, I'm going to stretch that to look at how that applies to the conduct of nation states. As a consequence of that Erin Pizzey book, suddenly the legislators woke up and said the so-called sovereignty in the home should be porous. The police should be able to intervene when there is chronic violence, chronic abuse of human rights. Each of you here is the beneficiary, maybe some of you are the victims, of different forms of intervention in your lives. You're only here because of intervention to do with health, with education, with job opportunities, and so on. Some of you may have just finished a stretch in prison, so you might have benefited from that, I don't know, but it's another, or you might be the victims. Even some of you may have had a parking fine or a speeding ticket, who knows? But the business of intervention is not something peculiar to the UN. Translate that book to the nation-state scene, and you have a what I would call a political ethical tug of war between, on the one hand, the claims about sovereignty of the nation state, and on the other hand, the commitment to universal human rights. And the real dilemma for intervention by the UN is about that, concerns the breaking point of that particular tug of war. Now, there are three reactions of nation states to the business of intervention in their participation in that tug of war between sovereignty and universal human rights. You can see it going on at the moment over Syria, where China and Russia are saying we should respect the sovereignty of Syria. And three other members of the Security Council are saying, no, we shouldn't, there should be some kind of intervention. Three responses. One is to stand aside and ignore, to say, well, there's nothing we can do about it, we wring our hands, it's really awful. That went on for donkey's years, still goes on across just about every continent over domestic violence towards women. When I announced it in Harare a few months ago that Sakai Holland had won the Sydney Peace Prize in front of about 200 diplomats from all over the world, she got up and said, there are three major justice issues in this country and across this continent: men, men, and men. I thought that would get a bit of applause from half of the audience. Okay, we stand by and wring our hands and ignore. In particular, say, with regard to, it happened for years with regard to Burma. It was a sort of hands-off. It has happened since the creation of the State of Israel with regard to the Palestinians. I've spent a lot of time on the West Bank and in Gaza. I've seen cruelty in my life. The word cruelty never appears in the index of social policy books. But it's worth remembering that the biggest prison in the world is the Gaza Strip. About 2.6 million people basically under siege, locked up. But they're easily, by our main press, dubbed terrorists. When you go there, you recall that at least half of them, actually slightly more than half, are children. 250,000 of those children are going to school, all of them under the auspices of the United Nations. All the schooling available to children in the Gaza Strip is conducted by the UN. So we continue to stand by and say, well, that one's, Australia does what America tells it to do, and if ever there's a challenge for Australia in its position on the Security Council, is to begin at last to find a little bit of courage to establish its separateness from the policies of the United Nations, in particular with regard to that awful deep-seated conflict between Israel and Palestine. I was in a village in Rafah on the Egyptian border at the beginning of the year. We were there to have a look at how well our money, I was with the trade union movement, was spent on establishing a modest rabbit farm so that a couple of families would have minimal food. A Israeli drone comes over, or had come over a couple of months before. The mother of the family is in the backyard cooking with her 21-year-old daughter over an open fire, and she's wiped out. And the 8-year-old child watches the 21-year-old bleed to death. The Israeli government and military wash their hands of it, so they are not held accountable. So the business of people not being held accountable and totally ignoring the principles established by the UN, in particular with regard to Palestine, because there the attitude has been, who cares about international law, who cares about United Nations resolution? That's one that really in your lifetime and sooner rather than later needs to be confronted. Second form of intervention is one that that is legitimated through the Security Council, through Chapter 7 of the Security Council. And somehow the nations got together and agreed to overthrow Gaddafi. That was a piece of intervention that was somehow recodified because of the language or the principles about the right to intervene versus the responsibility to protect. So you'll hear a lot about the responsibility to protect. And that intervention was argued largely because of the threat of what the world was led to believe would be an appalling massacre of people in Benghazi. A more significant example of intervention concerned the UN's transitional authority after the peace settlement after the Pol Pot genocide in Cambodia. And there the UN basically for a couple of years, became the government. It was the transitional authority run by an impressive Australian General Sanderson. The problem with any kind of intervention, and some of you will have had the wrong surgery, the wrong drugs, maybe you had the wrong kind of corporal punishment at school, or maybe you didn't get enough punishment, I don't know. No, I'll withdraw that remark because I'm going to speak about non-violence in a minute. There are always unforeseen consequences when you intervene, and you need to have the wisdom to anticipate those. One of the awful consequences of that transitional authority was the introduction of AIDS. So that by the time the transitional authority left, 90,000 young Cambodians, mostly disproportionately women, were infected with AIDS. Another problem was that some groups are easy to disarm and others it's very difficult. The Khmer Rouge was not disarmed. Nevertheless, for a long period of time in the transition to some kind of more reliable government, the UN played that crucial role. So the other reaction of nation states is that we don't care about international law, we don't care about the UN, we will take unilateral action. And the appalling tragedy of the Iraq War is an example of that. So those are the different responses to the task of intervention, to the responsibilities of intervention. Let me now come to the totally idealist part of what I want to say, and I think I've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. And that's about the language and values of peace with justice. The respect for human rights, the embracing of the language and philosophy and practice of non-violence, and the notion of a common humanity. Because when I've been in dangerous places and there's been dangerous conflict, you need to have the language that to fulfill in some ways the spirit of the Charter, even if it's a dark night, and most of my experience, I must say, of awful human rights abuses seem to occur on a Friday when it's dark and it's raining and nobody else is around. Let's have a look at what do you mean by universal human rights? It refers to what really was the most important document of the 20th century, generally regarded as the highest aspirations of the common man. The 30 clauses of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I often wish that no student could graduate from a university in this country unless they were familiar with all the 30 clauses. Unless we have a literacy about that, then your support for the UN will not be as effective as it might be. There are two major issues hidden within that charter, and they both concern freedom. Freedom, in Sir Isaiah Berlin's terms, freedom from hunger, discrimination, persecution, sickness, homelessness. You can't move unless we wouldn't be here today, well shaven and well perfumed, unless we took for granted that freedom from those forms of oppression. And that's coupled in a second set of clauses by freedom to, the freedom to which most of us in this auditorium would have experienced, the freedom to have reasonable health and access to healthcare, the freedom to have primary, secondary, tertiary education, even though I know you're being priced out of the market, which incidentally is actually an abrogation of human rights. Every time they put your fees up, you need to take them to court, I think. And the freedom of association, the freedom of press. It's the sort of freedoms that Julian Assange, marooned in the Ecuadorian embassy, is talking about at the moment. So there, in the notion of human rights, are those essential freedoms. When it comes to non-violence, I'm reminded that the wonderful philosopher and practitioner of non-violence, the Indian Mahatma Gandhi, said, he called it in Sanskrit ahimsa, and he said it was a law for life. And it's partly about words, it's partly about language, but it's also, as I look around this room, the way you dress, the way you've decorated your homes, the hospitality you show people, the poetry you cherish, the music you like, the art forms that you use to decorate your homes. I was taking part in a discussion about the appalling behaviour of the New South Wales police force who tasered that young Brazilian to death. I'll probably be sued for saying that. Let's hope I will be in some ways. Somebody said, well, the problem was, there were 12 large policemen there, 11 or 12. They didn't really have a mental health expert. They needed to say, this man is a bit deranged, we need to reframe what the problem is. The problem was that the culture of violence, the assumption that you can solve problems with big belts and big guns and maces and big boots and belts with studs on, has had far too long an innings. And the sort of authoritarianism and the bullying that goes on, not only in the playground, but often in the boardroom and in the memorandum that come down from so-called people, senior managers in universities, is part of that culture. I had a contract a few years ago from the Woodrow Commission to do something about the culture of policing in New South Wales, and one of the first few occasions we got together a certain number of patrolmen in a room in which actually had a portrait of Mahatma Gandhi. And what I discovered was that the language that used mostly was surrounding one particular word. It was easily the most popular word, and it was used as a verb and an adjective and an adverb and a pronoun. And I said, well, I have no objection to it. I frequently use it myself. But if we use two words, it would be better than one. It's because non-violence is, in Gandhi's terms, the law for life. And if you see it as symbolizing all the other things I've mentioned, in particular your hospitality, your ability to use power in an imaginative and fulfilling way for you and for others to promote that freedom too, then it'll make your life more interesting apart from anything else. Let me come to the last bit, which is the common humanity notion. When I was on the government's reconciliation committee, it was pretty obvious to me in remote places that Indigenous people knew what that was about. They knew that you couldn't separate their identity from the health of the land, that there was a complete interdependence, an interdependence of people and land and the cosmos. And in a way, it was that inclusiveness for me was captured best by a wonderful Aboriginal poet, Oodgeroo Nunukul, who also went under the name of Kath Walker. She said, if I can remember some of the lines, I'm international, I don't want colour jibes. I'm international, never mind tribes. I'm international, never mind place. I'm for humanity, all one race. And that was used partly in a campaign to establish the entitlement of Indigenous people to become citizens of this country. I think I'm getting stern looks from some of the organisers, which means I should wrap it up. But that language is of human rights, of non-violence, of the notion of a common humanity, much more important than closing our borders or protecting our borders or turning boats back. That applies to the policy making in New York, but it also applies when you're part of the Thin Blue Line or you're administering help services in places like the current refugee camps in Jordan on the border with Syria. I think that's quite enough, because one form of violence is to get a middle-aged academic to talk too much.